You are listening to Rechurched, a podcast aimed at instigating Christians to be Christian.
Hey, what's up, everybody? My name's Ethan Hoover, and you're listening to Rechurched Podcast. And I'm joined by my good friend and co-host, Matthew Maher. What's up, Matt?
What is up, Ethan? Welcome back, guys.
Welcome back. If you've never listened to the podcast, or maybe you're just getting started with Rechurched, this is sort of a look, high level, at what this podcast is all about. We want to rechurch the church. What does that mean? Correcting people's worldviews to make sure our worldviews are a biblical worldview. So ultimately, we'll go through, you'll see in season 1, we talked about the false gospels out there, and we address them biblically to make sure we correct our worldview to be a biblical worldview.
Because everyone has a worldview.
Everyone has a worldview, exactly. Then in season 2, we went through church history, and we took a look at the thread of the true church, and then the visible church, the invisible and the visible church. And we addressed some belief systems out there that kind of spawned because of Christianity. We looked at historical events. We looked at different political pieces, and we addressed it again biblically. And we did all that because church history is important so that we can have a better biblical worldview.
Right.
It's all about a biblical worldview.
And it's about, there's like an obsession these days in discovering your family tree.
Yeah. Genogram.
Right? Yeah.
Right? Genogram?
Tracing back. And it's compelling to see the origins of your family, the name, your ancestors, and think about that, and then pivot and recognize the importance of recognizing your spiritual family tree. That's the church. So we took our time in season 2 and looked at the origins because we want to see where we've come from.
Yeah.
And that baton, I like to call it a baton because it seems as if it's a race. And those that have gone before us, Ethan, have passed that baton to every generation.
And Paul talks about, running the race.
Running the race.
There's a prize at the end. The prize is Christ ultimately. And so that is the race that we're running.
And we're running now. We are taking the baton and we are seeking to hand it off to the next generation with a Christian or biblical worldview. Again, everyone has a worldview, which simply stated is the filter by which you view the world. And even those that say, I'm not religious, they actually have, in the right definition of the word religion or religious, a religious worldview. It just might not be founded on God or the principles of traditional religion, but even secularism or a belief that there is no God, atheism, is a religious, you're bound to, that's what the word means, bond, you're bound to a view. So we want to have a view that is as close as possible to the written, inspired word of God. That's the goal.
That's right. And so this season is, again, along that same line. We're continuing our goal to correct people's worldviews, especially the Christian, so that they are biblical worldviews. So this season, Matt actually, and we talked about this in, I think, episode 1, Matt wrote a short little booklet. It's about 57 pages or so long. And it's called Discerning the Devil's Playbook. And we're using that as our guide or our outline for the content in season 3.
Correct.
We're not going into every single sentence, every single paragraph, but generally speaking, if you read this booklet, and it's available on Amazon, and it'll be available at our church, Landmark Church in Ocean City, New Jersey. If you were to read this book, it'll help you kind of understand what we're talking about a little bit more. And then we might be going, talking a little bit deeper about certain things in the book, content in the book. So
there's a lot of content. I wrote it in short form intentionally, and here's the reason why. I desired that it was easily digested, right? How many of us have started a book and either because of distractions, life, or the length of the book, we put it down?
Too many times.
Right, and I'm guilty as charged. So when I was thinking through the content as the Lord was downloading it, I intentionally stopped short in each chapter to make sure that it was even intellectually manageable for every reader from all walks of life. I wanted to provide a very clear and concise overview, focusing on what I was calling watershed moments, key moments that ultimately were either biblical case studies or historical case studies, fine-tuning such examples from the period of Nazi Germany and then paralleling it in what we are witnessing unfold in our present society, namely America. Each chapter or play, as we're calling them, could have hundreds and hundreds of pages written for the play or for the examples. So again, I stopped short and picked intentional and significant watershed moments that were followed by a flood of consequences. That's how I want to put it. They were watershed moments, either in Nazi Germany, the 30s or 40s, 1930 or 40, or our present 21st century society. Watershed moments that were followed by a flood of consequences. And then what is the church to do to counter, let's say counterattack in the spiritual realm, those scenarios? The goal is also to give you the 4 plays so that when something unfolds, you can easily diagnose in the moment, okay, what play was that? What tactic, what scheme from the enemy was that? And the quicker we diagnose the play, the quicker we can, as a Christian, as the church, counteract the play with biblical truth. So that's kind of the heart behind it. I wanted the booklet to be approachable. I wanted it to be impactful. I wanted it to be easily accessible. And I wanted our readers, Christians from all walks of life, to have a biblical lens to look through to understand the very real challenges that we face. And that's why we started off season 3 with what we called the aftermath, which involved, if you remember, Ethan, the attempted assassination on former President Donald Trump on July 13th, a Saturday, and the bullet missed by a centimeter. And what could have happened had it struck Donald Trump would have been an ensuing civil war. But it didn't. And even the aftermath and what we saw online was evidence enough to see how effective, sadly, the devil's plays have been. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. The action of that led to the aftermath of the the action of the aftermath that led to an aftermath of the aftermath is the culmination of these plays being played out in it's a long game,
right,
that the devil plays.
Right. He's patient.
Yeah, because I mean, you use this example of Nazi Germany, and for us, I mean, we're not old by any means, but
thank you.
You're welcome. But you know, we enjoy history, so we enjoy learning about this stuff.
Correct.
The generation that's being raised up right now has a much looser grasp on the effect of Nazi Germany.
Oh, that's good.
And so
some don't even think it was real.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a whole nother story. Yeah. But with that in mind, the devil knows that. And it's a long game for him. He knows that it takes to convert. Ultimately, we'll talk about these plays, but the final play 4, convert the youth.
Right.
That can only happen after a long period of time.
Right.
And we're like hitting that sweet spot of the next generation, especially not really having an idea or a realization of the gravity that Nazi Germany played in the world today, especially against the Jews and the Christians. And so when you don't have that as like an anchor orienting you and keeping you from, drifting away, obviously drift is going to happen and conversion happens.
Let me just say, because you just touched on something that I think is worth bringing back up in the sense of biblical worldview language, or for all of our listeners to understand absolute truth, right? Which is objective. Truth is outside of us. It needs to be. It's something that ultimately guides us. And through the ages, the generations that have preceded us, you see a decline. And I just sent this out to somebody who reached out. I preached on it probably about a year or two ago, and they asked if I had that data, and I did. And it goes like this, Ethan. The greatest generation as they were known, born 1901 to 1927. So that generation, their belief in absolute truth. Amongst that generation, approximately 80 to 90% of those individuals believed in absolute truth, right? Black is black, white is white, male is male, female is female, right? They believed in, yes, there is an objective, absolute truth. And it was 8 or 9 out of 10 people.
Wow.
When you move on to the silent generation, that is 1928 to 1945, their belief in absolute truth dropped 10%, so 70 to 80%. So you're still a majority. 7 or 8 out of 10 individuals believed in absolute truth. Now, this is huge. Now, I'm not even talking about religion or Christianity, just absolute truth. Good and evil, right? What Adolf Hitler did was evil. Absolutely. No debate, no nuance. And then there's good. And we only know that when God and his word defines that. Or as some have said, what is called the laws of nature and nature's God. So there's a moral law that is embedded within us throughout the ages. The baby boomers, one generation after the silent generation, 1946 to 1964, they believed 6 or 7 out of 10, so 60 to 70% of their generation. Now notice what's happening here.
Dropping 10%
Dropping
about
10%.
every 20 years or so.
Now, the generation that followed them was Generation X. That is the generation born between 1965 and 1980. Can you guess the percentages?
50 and 60?
50 and 60. 5 out of 10 or 6 out of 10. So now we're tipping the scales here. Millennials, that's my generation.
It's my generation
right,
as well.
1981 to 1996, generally speaking. Our generation, the scales have been tipped. 40 to 50%. 4 or 5 out of every 10 people polled, millennials, believe in absolute truth. And here's where it gets devastating. The generation after us, Generation Z, born 1997 to 2012, 30 to 40%. 3 or 4 out of every 10. And here we go. This is the fruit of the world's disciple, or let's call it the devil's discipleship program, his disciples coming to age. Generation Alpha, born 2013 to present day. So these individuals are
the product of these future or these past generations.
These past generations. That's how it goes.
And if it's declining every 10%, generation to generation, these lower and lower percentages of people that believe in absolute truth are raising up the next generation. Of course, it's going to decline.
Of course, it's going to decline. I guess I wanted to begin that way because if Generation Alpha, 20 to 30%, 2 out of every 3 asked, do you believe in absolute truth? And again, there's a nuance to absolute truth, not in the sense of, define truth. No, absolute truth, meaning, do you believe there's good and evil in this world? Do you believe in marriage between a male and a female, and that's the union God intended? And there's a couple other pillars to what was asked in these polls, but with that trajectory in mind, I would never want to give a false hope. I say from the pulpit, I'm not trying to give false optimism. My responsibility is to present biblical realism. And the Bible is very clear. We are moving from bad times to worse times. And evil men, evil women are going to wax worse. That means they're going to get worse and worse, evil and more evil.
Well, we live in a post-truth age right now. So when you think about, okay, if you're past or post-truth, the only thing that exists is lies and deception. There's only truth and lies. So if truth is non-existent anymore, or very, very rarely existent, then of course the only thing that's going to exist is lies, manipulation, deception, misinformation, disinformation.
Right.
And you see that everywhere now. And you say, the rise of information leads to the rise in misinformation, leads to the rise in deception.
Yes.
And so that really leads us to the 4 plays. This episode, we've already covered some ground here, but we're just going to go over like high level, look at the 4 plays just in general sense, maybe talk through them a little bit. And then next episode, we'll likely talk about play 1 and kind of get into the nitty gritty of that. So the 4 plays, you love alliterations.
No.
And I'm just going to read through them, and then we can go through kind of just a high level, your thoughts and stuff. So play 1 is Contradict the Truth. Play 2, Control the News or Narrative. Play 3, Create Conflict to Groups and Nations. And play 4, Convert the Youth. And so I've obviously seen this content quite a bit from helping you with the book and all that kind of stuff. But a question that popped up in my mind that I think is valuable for people today is, okay, there's these 4 plays. Are they linear? And if so, why?
Right. Great question. I did write them, or at least the way I try to draft sermons or messages, to be sticky. I like alliteration, and in the finest sense, I wanted people to remember these. Contradict the truth, and they rhyme a little bit. Control the news, conflict to groups, convert the youth. Truth, news, groups, youth, right? Contradict, control, conflict, convert. So we added, obviously, control the news or narrative, because that's pivotal too. It's not just the news. It could also be a narrative in education, a narrative in even church. And of course, creating conflict to groups, and that would include nations, because that's one of the enemy's goals in his long game. So they're linear in the sense that you can look at the first thing that must occur is truth must be thrown off, counterfeited, compromised. There's no other way to dominate a soul or society if truth is there in its rightful place, anchored or as a boundary for the soul or for the society. Throughout the ages, Ethan, God has given humanity a moral sense of truth. Within us is a moral sense of truth. That's why my very own children, and parents out there know, our children, without even being told, they know quite literally the difference between right and wrong, which is why they sneak around to get to the cookie jar or to get to the snack cabinet. Why do they do that? Because they know it's wrong, right? There was instilled in them. So the conscience, 2 words, conscience, which means with knowledge, conscience needs to be oriented around truth. We would say biblical truth, the word of God. If not, there is a progression where the conscience then can become desensitized or numbed, or worse of all, deadened, a dead conscience. So a good conscience can quickly slip to a weak conscience, and that's 1 Corinthians 8. And then a weak conscience can quickly slip to a defiled conscience. That's Titus 1. And then a defiled conscience, and here's where it gets into very bad territory, a seared conscience. And that is 1 Timothy 4. And then ultimately, Hebrews 10 tells us there's an evil conscience. Right now, evil conscience?
Yeah, it's no longer like sitting on the sidelines. Now it's actually supporting the other direction. It's faced the other direction.
That's right.
Gotcha.
Terrible belief. And then ultimately a dead conscience, and that's Ephesians chapter 4. So contradict the truth being that first play, and you see that in Genesis chapter 3. That was the lie that was first asked and I call it the first question in the Bible. And a lot of people, when you ask them that, like, what's the first question in the Bible? They have to think deeply.
Yeah.
And it's the question that the serpent asked of Eve. That was the first question in the Bible in Genesis 3.
Has God indeed said?
Right.
Right.
Has God indeed
Did God really
said?
say? Did God really say?
And that's always the first question that the enemy seeks to bring to a soul or society.
Well, and it's interesting because God is truth. Truth is the basis, is the anchor for true human flourishing.
Correct.
But in the Garden of Eden, and you see it, the question becomes, is what is true really flourishing for humanity? Like,
right.
Satan is tempting the human and going,
right.
do you really think that's like good for you?
Right.
And then,
like, God is withholding something from you. Don't you see it?
Yeah. And so then obviously the lie leads to this improper, not flourishing of humanity, but actual degradation of humanity. But the human, Eve, thought it was for actual, like, the God was withholding true human flourishing, but really true human flourishing only can take place when truth sits on the throne.
That's right. That's good. That's a great word. Quickly, you see the fall of mankind. Eve succumbs or is deceived by the lie. That's why Jesus called Satan the father of lies. And those that are deceived or believe his lies are his offspring. Jesus also said that. And again, we're going to talk about some of the greater details and impact of this first play in the Bible, in Nazi Germany, and in our present day society. Ultimately, lies were let loose from that day forward.
Lies were let loose.
Genesis 3 rolls over to Genesis 4, and you see the first moment of, let's call it bitterness or jealousy or envy, whatever was living within Cain. You see the warning from God. Hey, Cain, be careful. Something's crouching at the door. What was it? Sin's crouching at the door. If you don't put it to death, if you don't deal with it, we say, if you don't kill sin, sin will kill you.
It's true.
And that led to the first murder. So very quickly, we go from the first lie or blame shift in Genesis 3 to the first murder. The rest is human history.
The rest is human history. And you go from play 1 with Genesis 3 to play 2 in Genesis 11.
Yes.
And play 2, and this is where my question kind of it's gonna keep popping up, is are these plays, do they happen separately in a different order, or are they linear? Because in my mind, you can't control the news or narrative if you haven't already started to contradict the truth in people's conscience.
I would say they're linear in the sense that you can look at them separately, but they're collective in the sense that they're inseparable. Any given play can be in motion at any given time. However, it first must start with some type of throwing off the boundaries or balances of a soul or society, getting someone to question, you know what? I'm not so sure about that point or that principle or that spiritual asset or truth. And then the moment you begin to no longer think critically is when the very next play finds itself sliding into place. And that is control the news or narrative. And you do see a culmination of that in Genesis 11. It's titled in most Bibles the Tower of Babel or Babel. It's where it gets its name God gives them. It was when there was one language and one speech in accordance with Genesis 11. And of course, I like to say, Ethan, behind every attempt to control the news or narrative is a Nimrod.
Yeah.
And Nimrod means rebel. There's always a rebel. And yes, a human agency like Nimrod, but ultimately incited by a spiritual agency, Satan and his demons. So we never want to neglect the spiritual warfare that is occurring, even though things might manifest in the physical realm.
Well, and play 2 is interesting because on surface level, it looks like, it's, the humans are unified. They're uniting.
Right.
But really, it's a facade.
That's
because they're uniting against the very thing that actually allows them to exist.
They are unified around defiance. That's one of the consequences if led astray by a Nimrod.
And we see that in today's media.
Correct.
Where it looks like, they make it look like, in some cases they make it very polarized. And in other cases you see, like, whether it's the Olympics or these bigger events, they make it look like everyone's unified.
Right.
But what are they really unified for?
Right.
What's the purpose? And that's where you obviously, you arrive there from contradicting the truth.
Contradicting the truth will roll over to eventually that same agency, a spiritual agency that is hell-bent on defying the one true God. And of course, in the case of the Tower of Babel, Bab-El, interesting side teaching, the word Babel, as the Lord places it upon these people, turns their languages into multiple languages and confused. That's what the word Babel means. So when somebody's babbling, hopefully nobody out there thinks Ethan and I are ever babbling on this podcast. They are basically just running on or running at the mouth. They're confusing in what they're talking about. So, but there's also a sense where Babel means gate, Bab-El means God. So gate to God. So they were building something. It tells us, come, let us build ourselves a city. Genesis 11, a tower whose top is in the heavens. There's a book out there and the title slips my mind, but there's a thought out there that they were building a tower or a gate to get to God. And there was an act of defiance on Nimrod's part. They knew their history. They knew that the Lord had flooded planet Earth earlier in their history. And it was almost as if they were saying to God, you're not going to destroy us. We're going to build a tower. Perchance a flood happens again. We can climb to the highest heights and make a name for ourselves. So that's one school of thought. And it's applicable because that's the rebellious state of man's heart. Or they were literally trying to make a memorial to themselves. And Nimrod was the chief architect of what looks like in Genesis 11, this is pretty cool, a one world order, a one world project, a one world religion, a one world government, a one world economy. And the Lord had none of it. And he comes down and he scatters them. And I like to say he turned their babble, their lying efforts into something to their own demise. And of course, redeemed it. That's what led to the order or boundaries of nations.
Right.
Which means God is interested in national sovereignty and identity. So I think, without getting too lost in the details, this play using Genesis 11 demonstrates the one dictatorial voice of defiance against the Lord. That's ultimately when the enemy controls the news or narrative. That is what he is after.
And so when you contradict the truth and you start kind of uprooting certain anchors there, and that leads to controlling the news or narrative. This unified, on the surface level, unified voice, but really it's a unified voice of defiance, automatically leads you to, I guess, play 3, right? It's creating conflict to groups because because maybe the majority or whatever stand for something, if there's still a voice of truth, if there's still people that are seeking Christ, there's going to be a strong divide,
right,
between truth and lies, and that creates conflict. But there's the natural division or polarity of light versus dark that will always happen.
Correct.
Truth versus lies. And we see that today. But there's also the purposeful division of conflict to groups. And I think that's what you're getting at with play 3 is the purposeful, hey, we're going to create division and polarity between, let's say, blacks versus whites, or
rich versus poor, left versus right.
That's right.
The list is long. And the verse I chose in our preamble that defines creating conflict to groups and nations was Isaiah 14:12, which kind of gives you a profile of Lucifer. And it tells us, how you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations. So there's a sense that Lucifer, this fallen angel, who we know as Satan, the devil, our adversary, he seeks to bring division. If he can bring division, he sows it, he can reap confusion. When people are confused, it's likely because they don't know the truth. Truth has been contradicted. They have fallen prey to the lie. The news has been controlled. The narrative has been controlled. And the only natural, emotional, physical, spiritual, political response to someone controlling the news and propagating lies is conflict. This is the baseline of war, conflict between nations. This is the baseline of dispute and division, even in families. So Jesus said profoundly, and there's a whole teaching to this. I don't want to get lost in the details. I'm just kind of giving you spiritual points. A house divided against itself cannot stand. The enemy knows this. And that is why he wants to divide our families, our marriages. He wants us to have a divided mind, even in our own capability. He wants us to have two minds. That's what it means to have a double mind, double-minded. We are to have single minds, single hearts, with primarily the thoughts of God that are operating in our lives, that govern our lives. So I think play 3 is extremely significant considering our present day landscape.
Yeah.
When you are watching so much conflict, so much division, you're watching. And listen, as you already said, the Lord also allows the division to take place. And if you're a Christian out there, I would be careful labeling it division, because you can get lost in the fray. And I would be quicker from a spiritual mind in labeling it separation. Because as these plays are linear and they're at work, what God's doing in the midst of each of those is redeeming and refining. And his goal is to separate the wheat from the tares, the sheep from the goats, light from darkness. And you'll see that constantly through the case studies we'll use, the biblical examples we'll use from Nazi Germany to present America in future episodes. We're going to highlight that. It's very clear when you begin to see it that way. So conflict to groups and nations ultimately has a target. And that's the fourth play.
Convert the youth.
Bring a conversion, as we've already started this episode with statistics about absolute truth, belief, worldview, converting the youth. And we've seen that over the past 100 plus years, that the youth or the next generation is being converted to become, and this is sad, you can call them parrots. I'm not trying to be derogatory or insensitive. You can call them puppets, but ultimately they have been misled. And that's the sad reality. They've been misled. And why? Well, let's go back to play number 1. Because God has been pushed out of school. Contradict the truth. You can't pray in the public school system. You can't read the Bible in the public school system. So what are the kids being taught in that type of realm? Well,
what's anchoring them?
There's no anchor.
Right.
So, of course, we teach them evolution, that they came from nothing, which means they're going to nothing, which means their value is nothing. And then we're surprised that schools get shot up, right? What a tragedy. Yeah. Somebody, just like the assassination attempt, somebody got to a certain place where these plays have been effective on their lives. And the result is devastating. And the devil, he laughs. And that is why the church in this day needs to find her voice. And I think this booklet, in my opinion, is a tool that needs to be in the hands of every Christian to read in short form, to recognize the plays, Ethan, and ultimately counter these plays with spiritual truth.
That's good. So obviously these plays are linear, like you said, and it's clear that it's gotten worse and worse and worse with each play that is played, let's say. So I don't think we're going to be ending on a high note here with this episode, but I think that's the point, is that the Christian should have eyes to see that, well, should have eyes to hopefully identify the play, but also have eyes to see that it's only going to get worse. Christ will come back.
Yes.
And he is going to make all things new.
Right.
And that's the only way to make anything out of where we're at. Correct. Is that hope that is coming soon. We're not making earth heaven, but heaven will come to earth.
I love it.
And that's our hope.
That's good, Ethan. That is a great conclusion. Again, we could have went into greater detail with each of the plays. I hope it provides a quick overview or summary. More can be said about even play 4, and we'll get to that. Daniel 1 was the ultimate case study of what it looked like to attempt to erase the spiritual memory of Daniel and his 3 friends in Babylon. And that's where we'll leave off today with this episode. I hope you've had time to check out our other seasons in Rechurched, season 1, season 2, and this is the beginning of season 3. Thank you for sharing this podcast in your social networks. Ethan and I are totally humbled for the support from those who have watched or listened in times past. We eventually upload even the audio version on our YouTube channel. So whether Spotify or Apple or YouTube, you can catch Rechurched podcast. I guess until next time, any final thoughts, brother?
No, you can learn more about our podcast at rechurchpodcast.com, thelandmark.church for our church website if you want to learn more about that. And you can learn more about us as well on those websites. So talk to you soon. See ya. God bless.
God bless.